On October 12, 1954, a 58-year-old Nazarene minister named Samuel Doss died in his home in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He had been admitted to the hospital in September with flu-like symptoms, diagnosed with a severe digestive tract infection, treated and released on October 5. A week later, he was dead. His doctor couldn't understand how his patient had died so quickly when he was on the mend in the hospital. That confusion, that gap between recovery and a coffin is what cracked open one of the most bizarre serial murder cases in American history. Personally, I have a huge obsession with serial killers. When I first found out about this case and when I first started this channel, my first 2 or 3 videos were actually about serial killers, and I have made plenty of shorts about them too. I get incredibly intrigued by reading them and uncovering new information about them, researching their minds, what's going on in their heads, how they think. Diving deep into their psyche is something that really hits home for me. It's also been quite a while since I've covered a serial killer case, so when this one crossed my path, I knew we had to talk about it. This video will be a bit longer than the usual ones, so grab your coffee or whatever you are eating or drinking, and let's get into it. Nancy Agnes Hazel, born November 4, 1905, who went by Nannie, took the surname of her husband, was an American serial killer responsible for the deaths of 11 people between 1927 and 1954. In all, it was revealed that she had killed 4 husbands, 2 children, and 1 of her sisters, her mother, 2 grandsons, and a mother-in-law. Nearly 3 decades of killing across 4 states: Alabama, North Carolina, Kansas, and Oklahoma. And nobody caught on. Not a single autopsy was ordered on any of her previous victims. And it's not just the body count, it's the duration. Almost 30 years of arsenic-laced food and drink, administered by a woman who, to the outside world, looked like exactly what you'd expect: a middle-aged grandmother in 1950s America. One local Oklahoma newspaper described her as a loving grandmother with a charming smile. She baked, she cooked, she smiled at neighbors, and kept a tidy house. Unlike the rage-driven violence of someone like Eileen Wuornos, Nannie case is a reminder that serial killers are not always overly violent or intimidating. Sometimes they come with a smile, a plate of home-cooked food, and a carefully measured dose of poison. Between who she appeared to be and what she actually did is exactly what made her national sensation after her arrest. Doss, a 49-year-old grandmother who appeared to enjoy media attention, confessed to spiking 4 of her spouse's food and drink with rat poison, and she did it all with a grin. During police investigation, Nannie was smiling and giggling, not showing any signs of guilt or fear. She was known alternately as the Giggling Granny, the Giggling Nanny, the Jolly Black Widow, the Lonely Hearts Killer, Lady Bluebird, and as one newspaper dubbed her, the self-made widow. The body count tells one story. She married 5 times, often meeting partners through romance magazines and classified ads, and confessed to killing 4 of her husbands. Frank Harrelson died 1945, Arlie Lanning died 1952, Richard Morton died 1953, and Samuel Doss died 1954, along with 2 of her own children from her first marriage, her mother, her sister, 2 grandsons, and 1 mother-in-law that I have talked about it earlier. That's total 11 confirmed dead. Various law enforcement officials in Alabama and elsewhere, however, speculate that she is likely to have murdered as many as 12 people. That exact number is still debated because Nannie never admitted to all of it. She confessed to murdering 4 husbands and maintained that she never harmed her bloodkin. She had a dual level of adaptability that made her incredibly dangerous and for nearly 30 years invisible. And here's what really kept the public glued to this story in 1954 and 1955. She didn't fit any profile that people had in their heads for a serial killer. Serial killers were supposed to be men. They were supposed to be strangers in the night, not grandmothers at the breakfast table. Her case sparked significant media attention as her seemingly harmless, sweet demeanor clashed with the gruesome nature of her crimes. Many questioned how a woman who appeared so gentle, so motherly could be responsible for such acts of violence. When you strip away the nicknames and the media circus, what's left is a woman who killed for reasons. that doesn't fit neatly into one box. Throughout her various confessions and the years in jail, Nannie insisted that money played no significant role in her crimes. Despite various insurance payments, her murders were actually motivated by marital boredom, a dream of discovering the ideal husband as described in her favorite true romance magazines. She collected life insurance payout after nearly every death. That's documented, but she told interrogators something that no one quite knew how to process. She said that she was searching for the perfect mate, the real romance of the life. Whether that was a genuine explanation or a convenient one designed to make her sound more sympathetic than calculating, that's a question that has never been answered. Most female serial killers do not kill for power or sexual gratification, but rather for financial gain, eliminating burdens, and in Nannie's case, she killed husbands who did not meet her romantic expectations. Both things can be true at the same time. She wanted the insurance money, and she wanted a love story she read about in magazines. The real question is which one pulled the trigger on each individual murder, and nobody, not even the people who interrogated her for hours, could ever fully sort that out. By the time detectives in Tulsa began piecing together Nannie's past in late 1954, they found themselves tracing a killing spree back to a childhood that reads like a catalog of damage, the kind of early life that criminologists point to when they try to explain how someone ends up poisoning 11 members of their own family. And Nannie herself, during confessions and later interviews, kept circling back to the same thing: her father, a train, and romance magazines that became the only world she wanted to live in. She was born in 1905 in Blue Mountain, Calhoun County, a small town situated between Anniston and Jacksonville, Alabama. Her birth name was Nancy Agnes Hazel, though everyone called her Nannie from the first time she was small. She was born to Luzia Lou Nieholder and James F. Hazel. She had one brother and 4 sisters. And there's a wrinkle in the family story that most people gloss over. There is evidence that Doss was conceived illegitimately as James and Lou married after 1905. Census records also show that in 1905 she and her mother were living on their own. Whether James was even Nannie's biological father is an open question. Jim Hazel, who may or may not have been Doss's biological father, was abusive and demanding and kept Nannie and the other children away from school for long periods of time to perform household chores and work on family farm. That's the household she grew up in. Both Nannie and her mother hated James, who was a controlling and abusive freak of a father and a husband. He ran the home like a labor camp. James would force his children to work on the farm, refusing to let them attend school, which resulted in Nannie's poor academic performance. Terry Manners, in his book Deadlier Than Male, described the scope of it by saying that by the age of 5, Nannie was made to cut wood, plow the fields, and clear the land of weeds and debris. Ball games and seeing friends were forbidden. School attendance was irregular at best. Nannie wandered aimlessly on an erratic schedule to and from school. Sometimes she went, other times she didn't, and so did a trio of sisters and a brother who came after her. If their father wanted the kids on the farm that morning to help with the field work, the entire brood stayed home. Her schooling ended after 6th grade, leaving her with a limited academic foundation. She was a poor student who never learned to read well. James wasn't just strict about labor. He controlled every part of his daughters' lives: what they wore, where they went, who they saw. When the girls were working on the farm, they couldn't wear makeup, attractive clothing, attend dances or social events. He forbade them from attending the church socials and the Saturday night events at Crispin's Tavern or the community hall. Makeup was outlawed. Silk stockings were made considered sinful. Fixed hair, hell-bent, and form-fitting dresses absolutely slutty. No daughter of his would tempt the male libido. When the time came, he often growled. He would pick the husbands for his daughters. Her mother, however, was considered loving and gracious to Nannie and her 3 sisters, Lou Hazel was by every account the opposite of her husband, James. Warm where he was cold, gentle where he was violent, but she was also powerless to stop him. There is the contrast between the parents, like negative infinity and positive infinity. Nannie grew up watching a mother she loved be dominated by a father she hated, and that dynamic, a woman trapped by a controlling man, would repeat itself across every one of her marriages. Doss's father worked as a railroader, but in 1920, when Doss was in her teens, she took over the family farm. And there is something else about the childhood that doesn't get discussed as often as it should. Her father believed that wearing makeup would actually make her daughter's target, and believed it not wearing it would prevent them from being molested by men. Despite this, she was raped multiple times in her childhood, which her father refused to believe. That detail is documented but often buried in the coverage. Her father's extreme control was, in part, his paranoid response to the threat of sexual predators, and it failed completely. So the one person who was supposed to protect her, the man who kept her locked away from the world, specifically keep her safe, didn't believe her when the worst thing actually happened to her. Then came the train. In 1912, when Nannie was 7 years old, the Hazel family took a rare trip. In an interview she gave to Life magazine in her later life, she tended to blame her adult problems on a head injury she received when she was 7 years old. She had gone with her family to visit a relative in downstate Alabama. The train ride was the thrill of her young life. She'd never been off the farm, much less on a vacation anywhere. But the trip went wrong. When the train was forced to make an emergency stop, Nannie jolted forward to slam her head on the iron seat frame in front of her. She suffered pains and blackouts for months, and headaches the remainder of her life. She blamed these and her mental instability on that accident. That claim that the train injury caused everything that followed became the center of her defense for the rest of her life. But did it actually cause her to become a serial killer? That's where it gets complicated. It's unlikely that she had any antisocial personality disorder in the way that the DSM describes, as there is no evidence of her displaying antisocial tendencies at a young age. But she does appear to be a sociopath, with her issues most likely originating from or aggravated by her early childhood head injury. Numerous studies in recent decades have linked frontal lobe injuries to increased incidents of violent and uncontrollable social behavior. The science on this is clear. The frontal lobes contain the main centers of personality, emotion, and executive decisions. They integrate cognitive functions, consider potential solutions, weigh probable outcomes, and initiate responses. Equally important, the frontal lobes also inhibit the instinctive behaviors. Thus, individuals with frontal lobe damage from physical injury or disease characteristically display uninhibited physical, emotional, and behavioral disturbances. But not everyone bought the brain injury story. Shelby Green, a direct relative of Nannie who spent years researching the family tree, had a very different take. While some writers with a social bent point to the train accident as the cause of her dementia to come, Shelby scoffs. Tongue-in-cheek, she replies that Nannie just had a plain old mean streak, and at trial the medical establishment wasn't persuaded either. She was diagnosed sane by 4 different psychiatrists before her trial date was set. 4 psychiatrists examined her. All 4 said she was sane and competent to stand trial. The head injury defense didn't hold up under clinical review. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But damage to the brain doesn't make someone a serial poisoner on its own. It takes something else: environment, opportunity, motivation, and Nannie had all 3 in spades. Her father may have been the trigger for the onset of her abnormal psychology, as he stiffed her girlish longings for romance, practically arranged her first marriage, and put the final nail in the coffin that held her ideals on love when he abandoned her mother. She resented him for breaking up their nuclear family, but she went on to destroy 5 separate instances of marriage for herself. What Nannie did have, even from a young age, was a rich and detailed fantasy life, and it came from one specific source. During childhood, her favorite hobby was reading her mother's romance magazines and dreaming of her own romantic future. Her favorite part was the Lonely Hearts column. These weren't just casual reads for her. They were an obsession, the only window she had into a world where her father had sealed shut. Terry Manners wrote in Deadlier Than the Mail that Nannie, despite her terrible mood swings, longed for love and Prince Charming. She was obsessed with her mother's romantic magazines, spending hours in her room looking at the happy couples. Over time, the Lonely Hearts Club ads became her favorite. The romance magazines didn't just give Nannie a hobby, they gave her a blueprint for what she thought life was supposed to look like. And when reality kept failing to match the fantasy, she didn't just adjust her expectations, she adjusted reality with the use of arsenic. As Nannie entered a dating age, she was held back from the ready boys of Calhoun County by a father who saw Nannie and her three sisters as field hands that he wasn't too eager to give up. She had zero real-life experience with men, with relationships, with the ordinary give and take of human connection, but she had a head full of stories about what love was supposed to be. And in 1921, at age 16, Doss went to work at the linen thread company in nearby Anniston. That job was her ticket out, or so it seemed at the time. For the first time in her life, she was around people her own age, outside of her father's farm. She met a young man named Charlie Braggs. And within months, with her father's approval, because of course James insisted on choosing who she was about to get married, a 16-year-old girl with no education, no social skills, a history of sexual abuse, a possible brain injury, and head full of fairy tales, was about to be getting married. In 1927, two little girls ate breakfast in their family home in Blue Mountain, Alabama. Terry Manners describes what happened. Both children seemed fine at breakfast, but had died by lunchtime. The local medics called their deaths accidental. Food poisoning, they said. Case closed. No autopsy, no investigation. Just two dead children and a medical system that didn't ask follow-up questions. The marriage had disintegrated drastically by 1927, and this period seems to mark the start of Doss's murderous habits. Their father, Charlie Braggs, wasn't buying it. According to family historian Sherby, Braggs has gone on record to state that he was frightened of his wife, as was his mother and the rest of his family. That fear didn't come from nowhere. He evidently had seen something wrong in Nannie's eyes up close. And within days of those deaths, after being warned anonymously not to eat any food his wife prepared, Braggs left with their oldest daughter, Melvina, leaving newborn Florine home with Nannie and his mother. But to understand how things got that bad, you have to go back 6 years to 1921, when this whole doomed marriage started. Nannie was 16. She was working at a linen factory when she met Charlie Braggs, her co-worker. With her father's approval, they married after 4 months of dating. 4 months only. That's barely enough time to know someone's middle name. And Nannie was walking down the aisle, but her father was the kind of man whose approval wasn't optional. It was the whole decision. It was mandatory. The crime library describes Charlie as tall, handsome, curly-haired man and notes that James' approval of him is because, unlike the other boys in Blue Mountain who idled at cafes and parties, Charlie's main focus, even above Nannie, was his mother. That was good intentions, according to James, good old-fashioned respect for his elders. What James saw was a virtue turned out to be the marriage's biggest problem. Braggs was the only son of a single mother, so Nannie didn't move into her own home. She moved into her mother's-in-law's home, and the dynamic was suffocating from day one. Nannie described the situation herself years later, saying that she married as her father wished in 1921 to a boy she only knew for about 4 months. He had no family, only a divorced mother who had taken over Nannie's life completely when they were married. Nannie said the mother never saw anything wrong with what her son did, but she would take spells and would not let Nannie's own mother stay all night. Her mother-in-law wouldn't even let Nannie's own mother sleep over. Tells you everything about the power structure in that household. Her mother-in-law turned out to be just as controlling as her father. And the mother-in-law's control wasn't abstract or subtle. It was petty and constant. If Nannie wanted to dine out and Mrs. Braggs didn't, the old woman would suddenly have a dizzy spell or a stomach cramp until her son was forced to give in and they stayed home. If Nannie wanted to go out to the picture show at the theater, the symptoms would return, and they spent the evening playing mahjong at the kitchen table instead. She took up a lot of Charlie's attention and limited Nannie's activities. Every small freedom Nannie might have had was vetoed by a woman who had no intentions of sharing her son with anyone. The Braggs had 4 daughters within a 4 year period. The first, Malvina, in 1923, and the last, Florine, in 1927. 4 babies in 4 years, in a house already weighed down by controlling mother and a husband who was barely present. The stressed out Nannie started drinking, and her casual smoking habit became a heavy addiction. Pressures from raising babies, pleasing Mother Braggs, and cooking for a greedy husband mounted, and Nannie was starting to crack under all of it. The marriage wasn't just unhappy, it was toxic from both sides. Both unhappy partners correctly suspected each other of betrayal, and Braggs often disappeared for days on end. Nannie wasn't innocent in this either. She had affairs of her own, sneaking off when she could, finding attention and affection whenever and wherever it was available, and Charlie would vanish for 3 or 4 days at a stretch, leaving Nannie alone with the kids and his mother, then wander back like nothing happened. By 1927, whatever was left to this marriage had rotten completely. 2 people who didn't like each other, didn't trust each other, stuck in a house with a dominant old woman and 4 small children. The tension had been building for 6 years, and it was about to break in the worst way imaginable. On August 30, 1923, a daughter named Zelmer died of food poisoning. On September 25, the same thing happened to a daughter named Gertrude. Some sources place these deaths in early 1927, while others date them to 1927 with different months. The exact timeline varies depending on which records or sources you see. These dates and locations vary in different sources. As such, it is difficult to figure out the exact chronological order of when Nannie's victims were murdered. These dates and locations are generally taken from death certificates. What every source agrees on is the pattern. According to Bragg's later statement, when he left for work, the girls seemed healthy, but they were crying while he was leaving and reportedly died in spasms soon after having breakfast. Doss could not provide any reasonable explanation. The official cause of death? Food poisoning. That's it. In rural Alabama in 1920s, children died from all sorts of things. Contaminated food, untreated illness, poor sanitation. 2 kids dying after a meal wasn't automatically suspicious to the medical establishment at the time, but it was suspicious to Charlie. Of the 2 deceased children, although there is no proof, there is the little doubt that their mother knowingly killed them. Overwhelmed and unable to cope with the responsibilities of her situation, Nannie cold-heartedly eliminated those 2 extra mouths to feed. To her, it was a matter of deadly economics. That analysis comes from Crime Library, and it is about as grim as it gets. The implication is that Nannie, drowning in a life she never wanted, the controlling mother-in-law, the absent husband, and the non-stop demands of 4 small children, dealt with it by reducing the head count. She was also suspected of killing her granddaughter and 2 of her 4 children with Braggs. The suspected method was arsenic, likely from rat poison, the same tool she would use for the next 27 years. After being warned anonymously not to eat any food his wife prepared, Braggs left with their oldest daughter Malvina, leaving newborn Florine home with Nannie and his mother. That anonymous warning is one of the more tantalizing loose ends in this entire case. Who sent? A neighbor who noticed something? A family member who had suspicions but didn't want to go on record? Nobody knows. But whoever it was, they saved Charlie's life. But why did he leave his 2 surviving children with her? The most likely answer is panic. He grabbed the child he could grab and ran. When Charlie left this time, it wasn't for his usual 3 or 4 days. He disappeared for months. His mother had died in the meantime, and he remained apart from something he was afraid of, not knowing where he had gone or if he would ever return. Nannie was forced to take a job to nearest cotton mill to support herself and Florine. The death of Charlie's mother is another detail that raises eyebrows in retrospect. Bragg's mother died not much later after Charlie left, while Nannie was still living in the house with her. The crime library notes that it was deemed a natural death, but given everything else that happened in that household, you can understand why some some investigators later looked at it sideways. Various law enforcement officials in Alabama and elsewhere speculates that she is likely to have murdered as many as 12 people, which includes her mother-in-law. Whether Nannie had anything to do with the old woman's death has never been proven, but the timing is hard to ignore. Another person dies under Nannie's roof, and once again, nobody investigates. Charlie finally reappeared in Blue Mountains in late summer 1928, a year after he had departed. He brought back with him more than himself and Melvina. He also came in armed with another woman, a divorcee, and her own child. Few words were spoken between the awkward adults, and Nannie took the hint. She packed her personal belongings, dressed her two daughters, and left. They were divorced in 1928. Braggs returned with Melvina and a new love interest in late 1928, and Doss took her daughters and moved back in with her parents. Working in a local cotton mill to support herself and her children, that was it. 7 years of marriage, 2 of them dead. And it ended with Charlie showing up on the porch with a new woman while Nannie stood in the doorway holding 2 little girls. Sherby summed it up, saying that Charlie is known as the husband who got away. He would earn the uncertain distinction of being the only husband not to die at the hands of Nannie, and he earned that distinction not through strength or cleverness, but through fear. He saw something in the house, something in Nannie, that made him run, and unlike the 4 men who came after him, he trusted that instinct. Nannie, meanwhile, was back where she started, living with her parents, working at the cotton mill, raising 2 daughters alone. The fairy tale romance she had dreamed about since she was a girl, reading her mother's magazine, hadn't materialized. It had cuddled into something ugly: infidelity, control, dead children, and a husband who left her for another woman. Alone again, Doss returned to her childhood passions of reading romance magazines. But this time, she began corresponding with some of the men who advertised in the Lonely Heart column. She wasn't going to let her father pick the next one. This time, she'd find her own man, through the mail, through the classified ads, through the same romantic fantasies that had kept her going since she was a kid on her father's farm. That's where she met her second husband, Robert Franklin Hurlson. They met and married in 1929. So this is where the pattern really starts to take shape. And this is not just the husband. Look at the people around him. Nannie was 23 when she married Frank in 1929. Her first husband, Charlie Braggs, had gotten out alive. Frank wasn't so lucky. But before we get to Frank, you have to understand the years leading up to his death, because Nannie didn't just kill him, she killed other people first, and in doing so, she was essentially running drills, testing the method, figuring out what she could get away with. She met Frank through Lonely Heart columns. This became her signature move, finding men through personal ads in magazines. For Nannie, those columns weren't just a way to meet someone, they were a way to reinvent herself. She could present as whoever she wanted to be. A sweet, lonely widow looking for companionship. That was the bait. Frank, though, wasn't the prize she was hoping for. She quickly found out he was a heavy drinker and he had a criminal record. That is the thing about Nannie. She wanted the fantasy, but the men she kept picking up were drunks, cheaters, or just plain rough. And when reality didn't match the fantasy, she didn't get a divorce. She reached for arsenic. Now see, the strange thing is, before she killed Frank, 2 other people died around her, and both deaths were on paper accidents. The first was her own grandson, Robert Lee Weaver. He was just a baby, born in 1943. Nannie was watching him one day, and according to the story she told, the child fell onto a hat pin she was holding, a hat pin to the brain. The baby died. Officials ruled it accidental. Then in 1945, her sister Dovie Doss died. Dovie was living with Nannie and Frank at the time. She got sick suddenly, severe stomach pain, vomiting. The doctors called it as stomach ailment. Dovie was dead within days. So what finally pushed Nannie over the edge with Frank? It was August 1945, VJ Day, the end of World War II. Everyone was celebrating. Frank was drinking heavily, and according to Nannie's later confession, he came home drunk and raped her. She said it was the moment she decided he had to die. Now you have to take that with some caution. Nannie was a storyteller. She knew how to make herself sympathetic, but the core of it, the humiliation, the rage, that part was real. For Nannie, a man who disappointed her was one thing. A man who humiliated her was a target. Her method was simple. She put arsenic in a jar of moonshine. Frank drank it. The coroner at the time ruled it as a heart attack brought on by acute alcoholism. rheumatism. No one tested for poison, no one even thought of it. And here's the part that's easy to miss. After Frank died, Nannie collected on his life insurance policy. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was money. And most importantly, she was free. Free to find next man, the next fantasy. The details of her grandson and her sister, she never confessed to those. When police later questioned her about them, she'd wave it off, say that they were just tragedies. But the pattern was already there. The same pattern she'd repeat over and over. Sickness, death, and sympathetic widow, and a quiet payout. And no one asking the questions. Frank was the first husband she killed, but he wasn't the last, and in the years after his death, Nannie would refine her technique. She'd learned the arsenic was easy to get, easy to administer, and nearly impossible to detect unless someone was specifically looking for it. And in 1940s, no one was looking. She walked away from Frank's death clean. No suspicion, no investigation. Just a grieving widow who packed up and moved on to the next town, the next Lonely Hearts ad, and the next man who would make the mistake of marrying her. After Frank died, Nannie didn't wait long. She collected the insurance money and moved on to Lexington, North Carolina. New town, new name, new story. She met Arlie Lanning through another Lonely Heart ad. By now, this was her system. Find a man who seemed stable, marry him within weeks, and see how long the fantasy lasted. Arlie was different from Frank. He wasn't drunk with a criminal record, but he had his own problems. He was a known womanizer, and he liked his whiskey. In Nannie's eyes, that was the same sin. A man who wasn't devoted to her was a man who didn't deserve to live. They married in 1945, right after Frank's death. For a few years, things seemed quiet, but Nannie was watching, waiting for the moment when Arlie's flaws outweighed his usefulness. The moment came in 1950. Arlie got sick, really sick. Nannie told the doctors he had the flu. She said that she'd been nursing him, giving him food, trying to keep him alive, trying to keep his strength up. One of the meals she prepared was stewed prunes. Arlie ate them, got worse, and died within days. The official cause of death? Heart failure again. The doctor noted that Arlie had been a heavy drinker and assumed his heart just gave out. No autopsy, no toxicology screen. He was buried and Nannie collected another insurance payout. What the doctors didn't know, what no one knew until years later, was that those stewed prunes were laced with arsenic. Nannie had gotten comfortable with the poison by now. She knew how much to use, enough to kill a man, but slow enough that it looked like a natural illness. Arlie wasn't the only one who died around Nannie during those years. His mother lived with them for a while, and she got sick too. Sudden stomach pains, vomiting, and then death. Doctor said it was acute indigestion. Nannie didn't shed a tear. Then there was the fire. The family home burned down under suspicious circumstances. Nannie claimed it was an accident, a kerosene lamp knocked over. But investigators later noted that she had taken out insurance on the house just weeks before. The fire destroyed everything. Nannie walked away with a payout and a fresh start. By now, the pattern was clear. People around her died. She collected money and she moved on. After Arlie's death, Nannie didn't stay in North Carolina. She moved west to Idaho to live with one of her sisters, but even there, death followed her. Her sister Dovie, the same sister who had died earlier according to some records, again became ill. Wait, that doesn't line up. Let's be clear, Dovie had already died in 1945 during Nannie's marriage to Frank. But here's the thing, Nannie had multiple sisters. Historians and court records later tangled the names. What matters is this: while Nannie was in Idaho, another sister died under circumstances that looked an awful lot like arsenic poisoning. Stomach pain, vomiting, and rapid decline. No autopsy, no questions. Nannie told people her sister had a weak stomach. She collected no insurance money from that death, but she did get something else: sympathy. She was the grieving sister, the one who'd lost so many loved ones. It made her look harmless. By 1952, Nannie had buried 3 husbands and at least 4 other family members. She'd collected insurance payouts from each husband. She'd buried a house to the ground, and no one, not a single doctor, cop, or coroner, had even ordered an autopsy on any of them. But after Arlie, she was getting bolder. She didn't wait long before placing another Lonely Heart ad. Her next husband would be Richard Morton, a man who made the mistake of cheating on her, and that mistake, like all the others, would cost him his life. Richard L. Morton was her 4th husband. They married in 1952, and Nannie moved with him to Emporia, Kansas. On paper, this was supposed to be a fresh start, a new start, a new house, a new man. But for Nannie, fresh starts never lasted, because whatever and wherever she went, she carried the same expectations, the same fantasies, and the same jar of arsenic. Richard wasn't a drunk like Frank. He wasn't a womanizer like Arlie. But he had his own flaw, one that in Nannie's mind was unforgivable. He cheated on her. We didn't know exactly when she found out, but we know what happened after she did. The same pattern emerged. Richard started getting sick. Stomach pains, vomiting, and weakness. The kind of illness that doctors in 1950s would attribute to a bad stomach. No one tested for poison. But before Richard died, someone else in household got sick first. Nannie's mother, Lily Weaver, was living with them in Emporia, and in 1953, Lily died. The official cause was listed as heart attack, but here's what you need to understand about Lily's death. It was the first time Nannie had a clear, undeniable motive that went beyond romantic disappointment. Lily was elderly, she was sick, she needed care, and Nannie, the woman who'd spent her whole life chasing romance and escape, was now stuck as a full-time caregiver. She resented it. In her late confession, she admitted as much. Her mother was a burden, a drain on her time, her energy, her freedom. So Lily died. No autopsy, no investigation. Just another elderly woman with a weak heart. But there's something else. After Lily died, Nannie didn't just feel relief. She felt encouraged. If she could kill her own mother and walk away clean, then Richard, a cheating husband, was nothing. Richard died later that same year in 1953. Just months after Lily was buried. Nannie's method was the same as always. Arsenic. Slow, cumulated doses that mimicked a natural illness. Richard would eat a meal, get sick, recover slightly, then got worse. The doctors called it gastritis. They never once tested his stomach contents. By the time Richard died, Nannie had become a master of this. She knew how to play the role of the devoted wife, the one who sat by his side, who spoon-fed him soup, who wept when he took his last breath. She collected the insurance money. She told people she was devastated. And then, almost immediately, she started looking for her fifth husband. Richard Morton's death is a turning point in Nannie's story for a few reasons. First, it was fast. She married in 1952, killed her mother in 1953, and killed him in 1953. That's a compressed timeline compared to her previous marriages. She was getting quicker, more efficient, less patient with the fantasy phase. Second, it shows how her motives were shifting. With Frank, she claimed revenge for with Arlie, it was frustration over his drinking and infidelity. With Richard, it was simple. He cheated, and she wanted his money. There is no grand romance here, no tragedy she could spin to make herself sympathetic. Just a husband who betrayed her and a wife who poisoned him for it. Third, and this is important, by the time Richard died, Nannie had killed at least 8 people, possibly more, and no one had ever come close to catching her. But the impunity was about to end, because her fifth husband, Samuel Doss, would be the one who broke her, and not because he was a bad man, but because he was a decent one. And because for the first time in her life, Nannie married someone who wouldn't just die quietly. Richard was buried in 1953. Within months, Nannie was remarried. And within a year, she'd be sitting in Tulsa jail cell, giggling at police as they asked her why she'd killed her husband with enough arsenic to kill 20 men. On the paper, Samuel looked like the person who she was looking all along. He wasn't a drinker. He wasn't a womanizer. He was a businessman in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He went to church. He paid his bills. He treated her with respect. That should have been enough. But for Nannie, it wasn't, because Samuel had a quality that in her mind was worse than cheating or drinking. He was controlling. Samuel didn't drink or run around, but he ran his household like a business. He was tight with money. He kept close eye on everything Nannie did. He didn't like her reading those romantic magazines, and same ones she'd been obsessed with since she was a girl. He thought they were foolish, a waste of time. For most wives, that would be an annoyance, but for Nannie, it was betrayal. Samuel wasn't just restricting her spending, he wasn't restricting her escape, her freedom. She later told police that he wouldn't let her have any fun. She'd killed before for less than that, and now, barely after a year after burying Richard, she started planning Samuel's death. Nannie went back to the method that had worked on so well on Arnie and other husbands, a meal laced with arsenic. This time, it was a prune cake. She served it to Samuel in summer of 1953. He got sick immediately, but unlike previous husbands, Samuel didn't waste away quickly and quietly. He was a tough man. He fought it, and when the symptoms didn't let up, he did something none of her other husbands ever did. He went to a doctor. The doctor, Dr. Charles Jones, admitted him to the hospital. Samuel spent nearly a a month there, slowly recovering. Doctors ran tests. They couldn't figure out what had made him so sick. Food poisoning, they guessed, maybe a virus. No one mentioned arsenic. Nannie played the part perfect. She visited him. She sat by his bedside. She bought him food that she prepared herself, though the hospital staff probably kept it away from him. She told the doctors how worried she was. Samuel got better. In October 1953, he was released and went home. You'd think almost killing a man and watching him spend a month in the jail would make someone back off. But not Nannie. She saw his recovery as a failure. She had to finish the job. But this time, she didn't wait long. Within days of his return home, she made him a cup of coffee. She laced it with enough arsenic to kill a horse. Samuel drank it, and this time there was no recovery. He went down fast, vomiting, cramping, his body shutting down. He was dead within hours. Nannie called the doctor. She told them her husband had passed away. Heart attack, she said, or maybe complications from his earlier illness. She was calm. She was grieving. She was ready to collect the insurance money and ready to move on. But something went wrong this time. Something she hadn't counted on. Dr. Charles had treated Samuel during the month-long hospital stay. He watched a man who was otherwise healthy get violently ill, recover, and then die within days of going home. Something didn't sit right with him. Jones was a good doctor, the kind who paid attention. He remembered Samuel's symptoms, the vomiting, the stomach pain, and the way his body seemed to be shutting down from the inside. Those weren't the symptoms of a heart attack. They were the symptoms of poison. He also remembered Nannie, the way she acted at the hospital, the food she kept bringing. At the time, he had thought nothing of it, but after Samuel died, he started asking questions. Jones did something that in 1950s was rare in cases like this. He refused to sign the death certificate without an autopsy. That was the moment Nannie's run ended. For over a decade, she'd relied on small-town doctors who saw a grieving widow and signed off on a heart attack. But Dr. Jones wasn't that kind of a doctor. He pushed for a post-mortem examination, and when the autopsy was performed, the results were staggering. The medical examiner found enough arsenic in Samuel's body to kill 20 men. She was arrested in 1954, and during the interrogation, she did something that would cement her place in true crime history. She sat in the police station surrounded by detectives and giggled. The Giggling Granny was born. But the giggling was just the beginning, because once they started digging, they realized Samuel wasn't her first victim. He wasn't even her fifth. He was just the one who finally got her caught. The arrest in Tulsa was just the beginning. Nannie sat in that police cell, and for a while she didn't say much. But when she did start talking, the detectives realized they weren't dealing with grieving widow who just snapped once. They were dealing with something else entirely. When the autopsy results came back, and they were beyond anything Jones expected, Samuel's stomach and tissue contained enough arsenic to kill 20 men. That was a deliberate, massive overdose. Nannie wasn't just poisoning him, she was making sure he didn't survive this time. Once police confronted Nannie with the autopsy results, she didn't even try to run. She didn't lie up. She started talking. She had been describing a murder, someone dying in agony, and she'd let out a little chuckle. Detectives later said it was the most unsettling thing they've ever seen. She wasn't remorseful. She was almost amused. She confessed to killing 4 husbands: Frank, Harlinson, Arlie, Lanning, Richard Morton, and Samuel Doss. That was 4. But she was adamant about 2 things. First, she denied killing her first husband, Charlie Braggs, and there's a reason to believe her. He was the only one who got out alive. Second, she denied killing any of the children or family members. Her grandson, her sisters, her mother, the mother-in-law, all of them, she claimed, died naturally. And I think that is not true. Police didn't believe her either, but without bodies exhumed and tested, they couldn't prove otherwise. So they started digging, literally. For the next several months, the authorities across 4 states, Oklahoma, Alabama, North Carolina, and Kansas, began exhuming bodies. Frank came up first, then Arlie, then Richard, then Nannie's mother, Lily, and others. The exhumations were a logistical nightmare. These were graves that had been in ground for years, sometimes a decade or more. But the science was straightforward. Arsenic preserved tissues. It doesn't break down like other poisons. If the body had arsenic, it would still be there. In Frank's case, they found arsenic. In Arlie's case, they also found arsenic. In Richard and Lily, arsenic was also present. One by one, the graves confirmed what the police already suspected. Nannie had been poisoning people for 20 years. She claimed her mother died of a heart attack, but the exhumation showed arsenic. She claimed her sister Dovie died of a stomach disorder, but again, arsenic. The only reason they didn't find arsenic in her grandson's body was because they never exhumed him. By the time investigators got around to it, the grave had been moved. Records were lost and the trail went cold. The final count, based on exhumations and confessions, stood at 11 suspected murders. But even that number is a soft one. Nannie traveled. She had family scattered across the South. There could have been more. So why did she do it? That's the question everyone wanted answered. And Nannie, for all her giggling, never gave a straight answer. The prosecutors argued it was about money, and the evidence supported that. She collected insurance policies on every husband she killed. She was building a life on death benefits. When she married Samuel, she had already taken out a policy on him within weeks of the wedding. But money alone doesn't explain everything. The insurance payouts were not that huge. She wasn't living a luxury life. She was moving away from town to town, marrying men she met through lonely heart columns and killing them when they disappointed her. That is where the other motive comes in. Psychologists later called it a form of blue beard syndrome, named after the French folktale of a wealthy man who murdered his wives. But in Nannie's case, it was flipped. She wasn't collecting wives, she was collecting husbands, and she wasn't killing them for wealth alone. She was killing them because they failed to live up to the fantasy she had been chasing her whole life. So she killed them, and then she placed another ad and tried again. The search for the perfect romantic partner became a cycle of marriage, disappointment, poison, and fresh start. When Nannie was arrested in 1954, she didn't look like a killer. That was the whole point. The woman who sat in Tulsa jail was 50 years old, plump, gray-haired, with a sweet face and a soft voice. She wore a house dress, she asked for a coffee, and when detectives asked for why she'd poisoned her husband with enough arsenic to kill 20 men, she giggled. The press descended on Tulsa like it was a circus, and Nannie was the main attention. And really, what a story she was. A grandmother, a widow, a woman who'd buried 4 husbands and God knows how many other relatives. The reporters couldn't get enough. They gave her the nickname that stuck, the Giggling Granny. It was perfect. It captured the contradiction at the heart of the whole thing. The sweet old lady who baked cakes and laced them with arsenic. Other papers also called her the Jolly Black Widow. The media framed her as a folk horror figure. Before the trial could proceed, the court had to figure out if Nannie was even competent to stand trial. Her lawyers pushed hard on the 1912 train accident. They brought in doctors who argued that head injury had caused brain damage. They said she wasn't insane in the clinical sense, but she also wasn't fully responsible. The prosecution brought their own experts, and those experts pointed to the same thing the detectives had seen. Nannie was precise. She bought arsenic from the drugstore under her own name. She managed it in carefully chosen meals. She collected insurance policies. She played the grieving widow. That's not a woman who can't control herself. That's a woman who knows exactly what she's doing. Competency hearing went for weeks. Psychologists interviewed her. She was cooperative, polite, and according to one report, pleasantly evasive. She didn't rant. She didn't hallucinate. She sat there in her house dress and answered questions with a smile. In the end, the court ruled her competent to stand trial. The brain injury argument wasn't dismissed entirely. It would come up again during the plea negotiations. But for the purposes of trial, she was sane. She knew right from wrong, and she was capable of assisting in her own defense. Then the story takes a turn that surprised a lot of people. Nannie's lawyers knew they were in trouble. The evidence was overwhelming. Arsenic in Samuel's body, arsenic in the exhumed remains of 3 previous husbands, a confession, even if she later tried to walk parts of it back. If they went to trial and lost, she was looking at the death penalty. So the lawyers cut the deal. Nannie would plead guilty to the murder of Samuel Doss. In exchange, the state would take the death penalty off the table. No trial, no jury, just a guilty plea and a sentence of life in prison. Nannie agreed to it. She stood before the judge, and when asked asked how she pleaded, she said guilty. No tears, no drama, just that soft voice. And then as the judge pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment at Oklahoma State Penitentiary for women, she reportedly smiled. The plea meant she never stood trial for other murders. No jury ever heard the full scope of what she'd done. All of it became background noise. For the one charge she admitted to, for the state of Oklahoma, that was enough. They had their conviction. They didn't need to prove she'd killed other husbands or her own mother. They had her own Samuel Doss, and that was going to put her away. Some people found that chilling. Others found it darkly amusing. The press leaned into that. They painted her a kind of twisted grandmother figure, someone who should have been knitting sweaters and instead was mixing arsenic into stewed prunes. In the end, the judge sentenced Nannie to life in prison. No chance of parole for years. She was sent to Oklahoma State Penitentiary for women in McAllister, and she was led away. Reporters asked her if she had any regrets. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said she regretted that she'd never found the perfect man. She walked into prison smiling. The giggling didn't stop, and for the next 11 years, she'd live out her life behind bars, until in final irony, she died of a disease that looked for a moment a lot like arsenic poisoning. The Oklahoma State Penitentiary wasn't a harsh place by prison standards. It was a medium security facility, and Nannie, with her soft voice and grandmotherly demeanor, settled in quickly. She was assigned to work in laundry at first, then in a decision that must have struck someone as either deeply ironic or deeply stupid, they moved her to the kitchen. Think about that. A woman who'd poisoned multiple husbands with arsenic was now preparing meals for the entire prison population. And as far as anyone knows, she never poisoned anyone inside. She adapted to life in prison better than the most. She made friends. She wrote letters. She gave interviews to reporters who came calling, always happy to tell her story, always giggling at the dark parts. She even found romance, or something like it. Reportedly had a relationship with male prison employee. Though the details are thin, old habits, it seems, died hard. In 1965, after 11 years in prison, Nannie started getting sick. The symptoms were familiar: stomach pain, nausea, weakness. For a moment, there was a dark irony in air. Had someone poisoned the poisoner? Had one of the fellow inmates slipped something into her food? The prison doctors ran tests. They ruled out poisoning. What they found instead was leukemia, acute, aggressive, and terminal. Nannie died on June 2, 1965. She was 59 years old. Her death went largely unnoticed. The media frenzy that had surrounded her trial had faded years earlier. A few newspapers ran tributes, usually with Giggling Granny headline on "One Last Time." She outlived 4 husbands, a mother, a sister, a grandson, and countless others. In the end, leukemia did what no one else could. There's something else too. Nannie was one of the first serial killers whose story was told through the lens of psychology, the brain injury, the romance magazines, the search for the perfect husband. And that understanding, however incomplete, became part of how we think about why people kill. The thing about Nannie is that she controlled the story. She confessed to what she wanted to confess. She laughed when she wanted to laugh, and when she died in 1965, she took the rest with her. The case file is closed. The exhumations are done. The witnesses are dead. All that's left are the open questions, the mysteries that will never be solved. Maybe that's fitting because she built her life on secrets. It makes a kind of terrible sense that she left with them. Yeah, I know this video has turned out much longer than my usual ones, but to really get into the depths of this case, it was necessary to extend it a bit. If you're still here and still watching, I salute you. These are exactly the kind of loyal watchers I need. Viewers who understand the depth and gravity of these situations and actually wants to know the truth. Like I told you once before, I truly enjoy covering these types of deep cases, and this content is specifically for those who wants to look beneath the surface. A huge thank you to everyone who watched this video until the very end. I'll see you in a new video, brand new case. Until then, goodbye and good night.